All right, hello and welcome to our first Tune-In Tuesday of 2024. My name is Jessica Pierce. I am a senior site manager at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and I'm going to be our faculty for today as well. And as a training and technical assistance provider, along with our partners at All Rise, the National Council, we're here to provide services and supports to all of you in your juvenile drug treatment courts. It sounds like somebody maybe needs to make sure they're muted, so everybody can double check right now that you're muted, and then we'll get moving on. All right, engaging families. Let's talk about it. First, you should know that today's webinar is sponsored by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, but anything that I'm going to talk about is my own opinion and not an official position of either the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, the All Rise organization, formerly National Association of Drug Court Professionals, or the federal government. All right, let's jump in. So today we're going to talk about engaging families. We're going to talk about maybe why families don't engage with you in your juvenile drug treatment court. We're going to talk about maybe some things that you're doing that might be hard for them. We're going to talk about current strategies versus recommended strategies. And then we're going to also talk about some real strategies for engaging families and kind of dismantling some of those barriers to family engagement. I'll tell you that you're probably doing more family engagement than you think you are. But those families that don't engage or that are really challenging are the ones that are sticking in your head the most. So that's a little spoiler alert. You're probably doing this better than you think you are, but there's always, I think, room for improvement. All right, so first I'm gonna use our old friend Slido here. So I want everybody to either scan that QR code or go to slido.com and enter 776294 and tell me what your definition of an engaged family is. So how would you define engaged families? They're present. Okay, so they show up, they come to court, they go to maybe family treatment. Then maybe they're present in their child's life too, right? That could be a part of that. There's good communication. Oh, that's good. Communication maybe with the team, talking, like giving reports to probation, maybe talking in court. And then hopefully they're maybe having good communication with their child as well. They interact with you, they're responsive. They're engaged in the process. They're offering suggestions and ideas. So if you're doing case management, case planning, they're talking about those things. They're actively participating. Oh, they're emotionally intelligent. That's a good one. I think it's hard. I'm not sure that all of us system professionals are always emotionally intelligent, but yeah, if they can be, that's helpful. Maybe they're honest. They're talking with you and sharing honestly what's going on in their family and with their young person. Let's see. I think that's all right. So a lot of these I can see can be counted, but now what I want to ask you is, how are you measuring family engagement? So I want to know if you're counting your family engagement. So do you have a number of different measures that you track, like court attendance and treatment attendance? Do you have a few measures you track, like especially court attendance? Maybe you don't track per se, but you could tell me who's coming to court and who isn't. For some teams, maybe it's more of a vibe than a concrete measure or concrete measures. All right, so at least some people really do have a lot of different measures that you're tracking. I think this is one of the most important things when we're thinking about anything that's happening in our courts, is that if we're not really counting and tracking and measuring, then we have a hard time knowing if we're being successful at those things. And so you want to make sure that you have a system in place and that you're actually tracking it. And then you're maybe making plans to improve it, right? That's the second half. Tracking is good, but then if you think, well, we like this, but we could do better, you got to have a plan in place to move. So when we're measuring family engagement, here are just some things that you can count, right? The number of court hearings that they're coming to, the number of family treatment sessions that they're attending, the number of reports that they're providing to probation, the number of non-court activities that they're attending, if you're doing parties or dinners or even family counseling or parent groups, number of case planning sessions that they're attending. And then I broke out also the number of inputs they're having into the case planning. So if they come to the case planning session, but they don't really talk much, maybe you only count that as like half participation, right? When we think about this, I want you to think about giving your families a rating about their family engagement so that you can say, yes, this family is fully engaged, or no, this family isn't engaged entirely, but they're maybe partly engaged. So here I give an example of a color system. So you could have families that are red, right? The red light, so they're not entirely engaged, or they're not engaged at all. They won't show up to anything. They don't return your phone calls. There's yellow where they're a little bit engaged, but maybe it's a little bit of a problem. You've got green, which is where they're totally engaged. And then I added blue because occasionally you'll have families that are very engaged, right? They're the ones who are saying, hey, I'd like to start a parent support group, or they're the ones who are offering rides to other kids when they're bringing their own child. So there's different ways to do this. You can have a grade system as well, but for each family, you should have sort of a way to look at it objectively and then talk about their level of engagement. This is one example, but I want you to think about, again, we can track that, we can measure it, but then I want you to think about how would you as a team move somebody up a category? So if you have families that are in the red, how would you move them into yellow? What would you do? And do you have the capacity to take concrete steps to change that? Family engagement is all about really spending the time, right? That we want to think about what your team can accomplish. And maybe you're not going to be able to make a plan for moving families from one phase to another for a while. You're just going to have to think about, you're going to say, we've got our color system in place. We know where the families are at. That's good enough for us. And that's okay. But we want to be thinking about this, right? We want to have a plan in place if we want to increase our family engagement. Now, you'll notice when we're looking at those measures and when we're talking about that color system, that's all compliance stuff, right? We're really good at compliance. We're really good at compliance with the youth and juvenile drug treatment courts, and we're really good at counting compliance with families in juvenile drug treatment courts. So you can require compliance. You can require parents to show up at certain times and do certain things. You can't really require them to be supportive of their youth, though. And I think sometimes when we talk about family engagement, it's not so much the compliance stuff that you're thinking about, right? It's this idea that you want these families to become protective factors for their youth if they're not currently. You want them to be capable of parenting their youth. You want them to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. This is where we get into a lot of challenges for juvenile drug treatment court teams, because that idea of support is not something you can mandate. You can try to order it as a judge, but again, we can't really make people do something if they don't want to do it. So think about your compliance stuff. You can count that, you can require that, and then let's talk about how to get families to become more supportive of their youth and how you as the team can help them do that. Okay, so that's what we're going to move into now. So why don't families engage in juvenile drug treatment court or in just juvenile court altogether? Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons. And I'll tell you what, this is a well-researched area. There are a ton of researchers that love to talk to kids and families about their experiences in court. You can Google right now, like family engagement in court research, and there'll be 4 or 6 or 8 different studies that you can read multiple articles about that will tell you about how families and kids are feeling about all of you in court. And you're probably not going to be terribly surprised by any of these findings, which is that families and kids think that you don't like them and that you don't trust them. And I think that's probably because a lot of times you don't really trust the families and you do kind of think that they're part of the problem, right? So what do we do about that? How do we create policies and procedures within our court system so that even if that's the opinion of the individuals working in the court, and it's not that it's an unfounded opinion. I am not saying that you're wrong to think that, and I'm not, I don't disagree. I've sit in court and I watch all of you, and I see how frustrating it is to work with some of these families, especially the families who don't show up to things, who don't return calls, who want to make everything the courts to deal with, who want kids to go to detention for things that we would never send kids to detention for, like talking back to their mom. There's all kinds of things that are going on. So it's not that you have, that it's wrong to feel a little bit frustrated with your families. But again, that can make it hard for them to want to engage with you, because if you pick up that somebody's kind of mad at you, your initial reaction as a human being is to sort of, that you get defensive. So your families are in that defensive posture when they start dealing with the court, and they've probably dealt with the court before. So they've been in a defensive posture with court for a long, long time. I'm going to talk about comes specifically from some stuff that the Council for State Governments did. They talked to lots of different kids and lots of different families within the justice system. And here's what they kind of boiled it down to. Families say that they have a hard time working with the courts because courts are making unilateral decisions. Courts are very blame oriented, which, that it makes sense. They feel like things are happening ad hoc, like they don't get the reason why you're making a decision, and it feels super arbitrary to them. Most of the time they feel like whatever's happening with their kids is super generic and doesn't take into account any of their specific family situations. And a lot of times, again, like with ad hoc, your decision-making processes can feel very obscure. So they don't really understand what is happening or why it is happening. Luckily, we can flip these, right? Every single one of these things, we can do different things with how you set up your juvenile drug treatment court to do the opposite, really. So we're going to talk about some strategies for that. So if we think about sort of what it would look like if we have a family that feels like things are happening unilaterally, then we want to make them feel empowered. So we want to make them feel like they're part of the process. If we have families that are feeling like everything is really blame oriented, we want them to feel supported instead. The opposite of ad hoc, we're going to say, is comprehensive. Opposite of generic, that's individualized, right? The opposite of obscure is that we have accountability to the families. So this isn't about us holding them accountable. This is about the courts being accountable to families and to the youth. Okay. And again, this all comes out of this research from the Council for State Governments. But again, these are findings that happen across the board anytime we're talking to families of justice involved youth. So I'm going to talk about some actual, real, literal, concrete things that we can do to change these things. What does it look like if we switch? So if we're going to think about making families feel empowered, I want you to think very carefully about your parental or caregiver, guardian participation requirements. So you notice one of the things that we were counting is how often they showed up in court. And I know one of the things that you'll hear them complain about all the time is taking time off of work to come and show up in court. And I want you to think very, very carefully and talk as a team about what you're hoping to achieve when you ask parents to come to court. Now, you might be in a place in your jurisdiction might require that because the youth is under 18 and they have to have an adult, a parent, or a guardian with them. And if that's the case, then you can listen to some music for the next 2 minutes while I talk about this, because this can't apply to you. But for the most part, what we have is that parent participation requirement, the parent guardian, those adults that live with that child, those requirements can feel really, really rough for them, right? You can imagine if you were being asked to take time off of work to do these things, how difficult it would be. Like even when we have kids in elementary school, we have parent-teacher conference, you feel a little bit frazzled trying to figure out how to show up for that sometimes. your parents that are coming to court, it's the same thing. They've got lots of stuff going on. Even if they don't have jobs, they may have other kids, they may be caretaking older family members, all kinds of stuff. So think about what your bare bones requirements are for family participation. And I'm thinking in some courts, that's literally that parents have to show up to sign the paperwork because of the legal requirements, and that's it. That's the bottom tier. They show up and sign the paperwork, and then they incentivize every other thing they want parents to do. So we think about what our bare bones requirements are, and then we think about incentivizing those extra things that we want. This again helps parents feel like they're in charge, that they're not the ones who are in trouble. It helps them feel empowered and part of the decision-making process, that they can say to you, hey, I can't do this. I can't show up because I've got to work. And you say, I get it. We've all been there. And you help them figure out a different way to do this. During COVID, of course, we had lots of folks that, well, everybody was doing everything remotely. Lots of courts have carried that forward. So now parents have just an option. You can either show up in person if you can, but if you can't, then we're happy to have you Zoom in or even have you just on a phone call. So courts are thinking about how to do this in a way that's going to be just very accommodating of parents. And then again, incentivizing parents, lots of different ways to do that. If you don't have money for incentivizing parents, you can use the same kinds of non-monetary incentives that we use with kids, which is that we let parents, skip court appearances. We let parents pick the time and place for meetings. All of those kinds of things can be incentives as well. And you can write for a federal grant. If you don't have money to incentivize parents right now, I grant to add in parent incentives. So this is a thing to think about. The grant for this next year has not been released yet. We're expecting it anytime in the next 30 days or so, so keep an eye out for it. We will, of course, announce it via the same channels that you heard about this webinar. So if you see that come up, it's really worth it. Right now, OJJDP is really funding basically every application they get, so I encourage you to apply for it. Again, when we're thinking about this empowerment piece, we're going to let the youth and the families define who family is. So if you're in that place where you have to have somebody who's coming to court with that young person, but maybe mom and dad aren't available, can you let somebody who's not a guardian, but somebody else who's, in a position of authority in the family, grandmas, grandpas, aunts and uncles, can they come and stand up with that young person in court? So you're thinking about letting them define who family is. And then you're also working with your young people, especially to help them identify other supportive people within their lives who maybe can do some of that support piece if their own parents and immediate family aren't in a place to do that. And then ideally, really, it's the most obvious thing when we're thinking about engaging with parents, with families, is that we're going to try to schedule things at their convenience. And this is super hard because mostly the court is set up for your convenience because that's your job. And you don't really love the idea of doing meetings at 7 p.m., even though that's what's going to be easier for the families. But if you can do that, if as a court you decide that's a thing you want to try, again, we see much greater uptake of parents showing up and being responsive to the court if it's easier for them to do. Again, I know it's really hard because that puts a burden on you. It's a thing to think about, one of the trade-offs, right? And these again should all be conversations you have together as a court, as a team, to think about what you really are looking to do. All right, so what do we do if we're going to be supportive of parents? So one of the best things and one of the most easy tricks you can use when you're talking to engaging with parents and families is just say to them, I know living with your young person is not really fun right now, and it must be really hard for you. So we just acknowledge that the young person that has come to court, who has been committing crimes, who's using drugs, who's maybe having some attitude, both with you, with school, at home, just to say, this must be really hard. And that can go such a long way in diffusing that defensive posture that families have, to just acknowledge that they're in a rough spot. And you'll often just get somebody who says, thank you for acknowledging that, because I think a lot of times they feel like they're unseen in this struggle that they're having with their young person. You want to make sure that you're looking for family strengths and that you're focusing on family strengths, just like we do with our kids. And again, talk as a team about what you're going to think about for family strengths, and make a plan for how you can do that, how you can focus on family strengths. You're going to treat them as much as you can as partners. And again, this can be hard when we feel like that they're actually contributing to the problem. So what I want you to think about, if we're treating our families as partners, is that we don't want to put them in a position where they have to lie, or where they have to choose, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about how your families don't necessarily share the same values as all of you in the court. And I'll tell you, I don't think all of you in the court share the same values either. But if you get to a place where you feel like, oh, mom's covering for her child, then try to think about what you can do in your policies and procedures so you don't put a parent in a position to feel like they have to choose between being honest with you and doing what they feel like is protecting their child, because that puts them in a weird place, right? They feel like, I don't want to get my child in trouble anymore. I would rather tell a lie to the probation officer and hope I don't get caught. You don't want to set them up for that. It doesn't feel good on their end, and then you feel mad and it doesn't feel good on your end. So think about how you can treat them as partners, and how you can treat them again as rational adults within their own lives, who are making decisions that, again, might not be a decision you would make, but you can see the logic and the reason behind why they make that decision. So you're going to try to make sure that you're not setting them up to make a decision that you feel like is going to be the wrong one. We want them to be involved in the decision making as much as possible, with things like what's going to go into that case plan, and what makes family. We also would love for them to be partners with you in incentives and sanctions. There are some families that can be really helpful for incentives and sanctions, because they can do things that maybe you as a court don't want to do, like take away cell phones. And I would suggest to you as a court that if a parent imposes, or a guardian, or again, the people who are in charge of those young people, if they impose a sanction, that you just back them up. You don't have to do 2 sanctions for a young person. So if a young person has done a thing, they've skipped school, and their parent takes their phone as a result of that, as a court, you don't need to add another sanction there. You just say, great, this is the sanction. We're going to back up your parent in this way. That, again, is treating them as partners. They still have that authority within their home, and we're going to back them up on those things. Now, of course, there are going to be areas where you're going to be like, oh, that's too much of a punishment, or, oh, that's not quite enough of a punishment. But as much as you can, if they've done something, you're going to back that up. You're going to support their rules in the home, right? You're not going to let the young person triangulate you and the parents by the kid going behind their parents' back to have you do something different. We're going to always try to support those parents, those guardians, as they're making decisions for what's happening with that young person in the home. All right, so now I want to know from all of you, because you're all doing this work, and I bet some of you have some really good strategies. So I want you to share if you have some good strategies that you're doing that are empowering or supporting parents. So what are you doing to work with your families in this way? We have folks. Oh, assisting with transportation to and from court to alleviate another hurdle. Yeah, so I think that this is a really great example where we want to remove barriers that they might have in place for their participation. And so taking them to and from, and really being willing to talk to them and say, tell me what's really the challenge here. And if it is getting a ride, and you can do that as a court, that's a great one. I know in some places they have like taxi vouchers that they use for a lot of this stuff. The Montgomery County, Ohio team, I know, has done some stuff around that. Meeting them where they're at. So this is exactly what we're talking about, where even if they've got stuff going on in their lives and they may have their own problems, right? We know we have parents, you've got parents that are using drugs themselves, you've got parents that, you know, they have a lot of trauma themselves, all kind of those things. So recognizing that they're going to do what they can do, and that's as much as they can do. And that's where you as a team have to meet them where they're at. And it's going to look different for every single family unit. Making sure they have case plans that are workable. And of course, this is so important for our young people as well. They have to have requirements with the court that they can actually meet. And that means not just the young person, but their family unit as well. What can we do to make sure that that's the case? And if you see that a young person is failing at meeting your expectations and that their family is not able to do the thing that you thought, like transport the youth, we can't punish them out of doing that, right? We can't say, well, now you have to have extra community service or electronic monitoring. We have to help solve those problems. We have to model that kind of behavior where we say, we see that this is a challenge, not a problem, right? Those are two different things. This is a thing that we can help solve together rather than a thing that you're doing that's creating this issue. Support groups to discuss their concerns and address barriers is so great. Some courts have family support groups that they do that often are occurring at the same time that the young people are going to like a group session. There will be a session for families and caregivers. They get to have a support group. Some of the best ones I've seen when I go out there to visit your courts are ones that were started or led by parents. That can be really hard, but if you have one of those parents that like is in that category of being like level blue, those folks might be the people to tap into. We also see courts doing, having parents and kids do orientation for other parents and kids. So parents and kids that have been in the program for a while, they'll get to do part of the orientation. And having a parent who can talk to another parent about how it works and how it is to work with all of you, super useful. So if you have some parents that have engaged that might be open to coming and being part of that orientation for new folks, that can be very, very impactful. Let's see, have them involved in deciding best resources and supports. Yeah, the parents, again, they're the experts on their families. I was observing a court last fall where during pre-court staffing, they were talking about how this young person was fine in school and was on track to graduate and there were no problems. And then the parent came into court and the parent was like, my son is missing core credits and is in no way on track to graduate. And he has an IEP that is not being implemented. And the court this seemed like new information for the court that even though they'd been working with the young person for 3 months, they were surprised by this. But if you can take that information that you get from the parent and say, oh, we got to do something different, that can be super helpful because they are the experts and they can help you figure out those best resources and supports that they and their child need. Now, I know sometimes they have a story, they have a whatever they're trying to do, but as much as we can, we're taking them at face value and we're putting on our non-judgmental faces. And we're also just thinking about working those challenges. What are we doing to solve these barriers? Right, great. So it sounds like some teams have some good things that they're doing. If you think of other things, just go ahead and throw them into chat. Because again, this I think is so important to really think about how other teams are approaching this. Because you all are the ones that are doing the practical work here. All right, so what are we thinking about when we think about making things comprehensive for families? We want to make sure that parents, the caregivers, the people that live with a young person know what their child is working on. So certainly there should be in those case management, those case planning sessions. Not everyone, right? Like if you're probation, you're doing check-ins, you want to think about strategically when it makes sense to invite a family member to come, probably when you're setting up a new goal. For treatment, this is also so important. In treatment, kids are learning new skills about how to be in the world and how to communicate. And it can be really challenging if you are having a young person who comes up with a plan for how they're going to resolve conflict. If you don't let the other half of the conflict party know what's going to happen. So the obvious example here is when we tell kids, if you're starting to feel frustrated, you should just walk away from the conversation and take a minute to cool down. And they don't have any great communication skills yet. So they don't say to their mom when they're having a kind of a heated discussion, they don't say, I'm going to take a few minutes and walk away and calm down and then come back to this. Instead, they just sort of turn around and storm out of the room, right? And mom's standing there like, what just happened? And then she might say something like, don't you walk away from me. We got to let mom know, hey, your kid is going to, the next time you start to have a heated discussion, it's going to take a time out. You got to let him do that. And maybe you'll take a time out too. And it's going to help foster that communication. If mom doesn't know that, we just set up a whole new conflict for the family. That is the opposite of what we're trying to do. So we want to be comprehensive in what we're telling our families. We want to make sure that we are coordinating family services between agencies. Here at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, we really advocate for, as much as we can, a one judge, one family model. So that means that if this family has cases also in child welfare, or maybe they have multiple children involved in the juvenile justice system, that all of that stuff is being coordinated for them in a way that makes sense. So that they don't have to show up and do something for you on a bunch of different days and a bunch of different places. We're thinking about how to make this as streamlined and easy as possible for families to partake in the services and partner with you as courts. And then everybody in your system, the bailiffs, the folks running the metal detectors, all of the people who are at the court really should have some family engagement training as well. We want everybody to be thinking about court users, those families, your kids, in the same way and using the same kinds of strategies and skills when dealing with them. And I know that can feel hard to get everybody on board for a training, but again, I encourage you to do this. You can request a family engagement training from us via TTA 360, where we can come out to your jurisdiction and spend time with not just the drug court, but with all of your system stakeholders, talking about these things and going through some of these strategies. All right, when we're thinking about being individualized, so we're being individualized with our youth and we want to be individualized with our families. We want to ask parents what they need to be successful. And I encourage you as professionals working with families to meet with your parents, your caregivers, those people in that young person's life who are living with them, to maybe meet with them separately periodically. Some things parents aren't going to want to say in front of their kids, right? They aren't going to want to tell you about or want to say something about, like, you know, if they're struggling with housing and stuff. Some of those things are trying to keep from their kids. So I want you to think about when you can talk to those parents in a separate one-on-one meeting. It doesn't have to be super regularly, but you should be thinking about having those kinds of conversations to make sure that you are helping them get their needs met. We want to be really thoughtful about that cultural humility piece and recognize that all family structures are unique, and that depending on what culture they're coming from, they may have practices that you're just not aware of or not understanding. And so again, they're the experts on their own family. Hopefully they can help you understand what they need to be successful. You know, there's lots of examples out there of, in some cultures, you know, kids are taught that making eye contact with adults is really disrespectful. Not knowing that, you can sort of sometimes set kids up to fail if you're requiring them to look you in the eye. Some cultures, of course, we have different family members who are sort of the boss of the family, and it might not be that immediate family unit of that young person, right? It might be that the uncle is the boss of the family, or maybe the grandma is the boss. And even though that young person lives with his mom and dad, they're not really the boss of the family. So you got to be thinking about that and thinking about if those are other folks that you want to bring into some conversations that you have about the young person and their success. And then this idea that recognize that each family has their own values. And really, this is the idea that we don't judge people for their values that are different from our own. And that can feel hard. because sometimes I think we all feel like we share values together, but I don't think we all do. And, you know, some of us, like myself, I don't really believe that much in authority. All of you work in the court, so you probably have a much stronger authoritarian bent than I do. Some of you maybe not. And I know some of you now are like, all right, Jessica, you're dead to me. Totally fine. But it can be, there can be some challenges in that. And there's less likely to be challenges for us in this kind of setting. But certainly if you have families that are not really big on doing what authority tells them to do, that's going to cause you some problems in your court. Again, I don't want you to set up families to feel like they have to lie to you or to feel like that they can't be heard and respected. So you want to recognize that every family has its own values. Another thing where you and I might be different, I'm not really great at being on time for things. And I can be very irritating, I think, for folks if I'm not showing up on time. You're going to have families like that. You definitely have families like that. It's just not one of those things that is part of my value system. So you're going to think about how you can be engaging families who have different values from you and how you can still work with them and still think of them as being like, because we all are in this professional setting, you're going to cut me so much slack. You're going to be like, oh, but she's so great when she shows up. I don't even mind if she's 5 minutes late. You're not going to think that for the families, right? You're going to think, oh, they're wasting my time, and it's going to be frustrating. So we're thinking about that. We're think about changing your orientation, and again, giving them the same benefit of the doubt you might give another professional. All right, tell me about how you might be doing some of this individualizing or comprehensive stuff with families. And if you've already used your best ideas in the previous Slido, then we'll just move on. But does that spark something that you're like, oh yeah, this is something that we do with our families? All right, it seems like maybe we're not going to get any answers here. We might have already talked about it. Again, I really encourage you to meet with your parents separately sometimes to really be asking them what they need. I'll tell you, in our juvenile drug treatment court guidelines, one of the findings that led to better outcomes with for the youth in the programs was if parents were also receiving services. And I know that's really hard. When you do our court self-assessment, we ask you if you're doing screening and assessment of parents, if you can, and you can help them get the stuff they need. I mean, obviously it's gonna end up with better outcomes. And I see here we have meet with parents to do a needs assessment. And right, so if parents really should be part of our assessing of their young people, and then if we also can get some assessment of the parents and maybe hook them up with services, hook them up with their own treatment, it really is better for creating that protective factor. Matching my family's capabilities with my expectations. I love that. So this is about that meeting families where they are. And so you are going to change what you expect from a family based on what you learn about them. So we're not going to expect all families to be way up here, at least to start with, if we know that they're starting out down here. So we're going to just try to move them up incrementally into what we expect, and hopefully helping them get what they need as they go along. So I really like that. Always thinking about not just as a team, but then as an individual working with families, what that looks like. All right, let's move on to being accountable to parents as a team. So we have family members, we have folks who love and care about these kids, and all of you are kind of barging in and saying, hey, we can help, we can fix things. And they don't really understand what you're thinking or why you're doing what you're doing. So we want to explain decisions. Every decision that's happening in the court, kids and families should really understand what's happening, and they should be involved in those decision making on the front end. When we're thinking about, you know, our sanctions, when we're thinking about our incentives, they should get to have input all the way through the program. So if a young person is not meeting their goals, they should know what happens when they don't meet their goals. They should know what those sanctions are going to look like. Parents should also know. It should never be a surprise when somebody is getting a response that's not going to be super positive. Everybody should be on the same page that this is what was expected if that behavior continued, right? So it should never be a surprise. Everybody should get to have an explanation of those decisions. When parents want you to lock their kids up, and I've seen parents who are worried about their kids' safety, their kids are using drugs that they're scared about, and they want court to put kids into like detention. If you're in a situation like that where a parent is scared and worried about their kid and looking to you to solve that problem, I would suggest to you that your best course of action is to recess court if it's happening in court, or go into like a private room if it's happening just in the hallway, and just talk about what we can and can't do as a court system, especially in those cases when we have somebody who's worried about safety. Now, if they want you to send kids to detention because their kids just talking back, different story. But if it's a safety thing, you got to talk about what you can and can't do. Detention centers maybe won't take a kid for who's going to be detoxing, and that's fair. But parents need to know what you can do, and then hopefully you should have some options for them. So this is where we're thinking about, like that's hard stuff when we think about explaining decisions to parents. There's lots of easier, smaller decisions you can explain much more simply. But in the case where we've got parents that are worried about that, I think you got to treat that as a real honest worry and meet them in a place and talk about what their options are. You got to talk to them all the time, communicate early, often, and in multiple ways, right? We want to be talking to them at court. We want to be making sure when you're doing orientation for families that they understand what your expectations are for them. They should know what is expected as far as like that they've got to get their kid places, that they've got to do all of these things. You want to be you think you're being clear, but I want you to make things even clearer. I want you to spell out things that you think are understood. With kids, I often use the example of explaining the rules for things as if you're on a game show. Because every time we watch, The Price is Right when you're homesick, Drew Carey now has to explain the rules for how to play Plinko every single time somebody plays Plinko, right? That's a whole bunch of legal reasons why that is. You should be doing the same thing in court. You should be explaining rules and program requirements over and over again in the most plain language that you can. And again, we like to encourage folks to have kids and parents be part of the orientation. And we like the idea of doing 2 orientations. One orientation like right at the beginning, and then a few months later, kind of go back through and go over that same information again, because it's a lot of information to go through and it can feel overwhelming. So we want to talk about it constantly. You want to ask your parents and your families for feedback. And we want to do this in a couple of different ways, right? So you want to ask for feedback constantly while the youth is in the program. Lots of folks are doing exit interviews now with families or exit surveys. You can do surveys while they're in the program too. Think about what you would want to know and then ask them, right? That's the easiest thing to do. And you wouldn't do it, you're not doing a survey or an exit interview every month, but you're thinking about how you're checking in and how you're getting feedback from them really regularly. And then as a team, you're talking about it and you're looking at it and you're saying, what is this telling us? What kinds of trends are we seeing? Are parents complaining constantly about parking at our courthouse? And what are we going to do about it? Right? We're asking those questions. And then we want to think about inviting parents and family members, caregivers to be part of stakeholder groups. If you don't have a steering committee that's meeting regularly, then what I would encourage you to do is, if you have a parent who is of a former graduate who is really open to working with the court, you might ask them to come and meet just with your team. If you're not doing stakeholder meetings, just have them come and talk to your team about what the experience looks like from their side of things. It can be very eye-opening. Now, as a person at the National Council, I put on a lot of trainings for people. And what I find incredibly useful is when I go to somebody else's training and I'm a participant instead of the person behind the curtain, because then I can see oh, this is how this feels as a participant versus the person running the meeting. right? And so you can get that same kind of information from folks who have gone through the system, who can tell you about what it looks like. And then they can help you see where maybe you have extra burdens for parents, where there's more space for input from them. So having those interviews and taking some time to talk with them really can be helpful. So when we think about sustaining and having this as an ongoing effort, you want to make family engagement part of somebody's job. And I don't mean this as just saying our probation officers are in charge of interfacing with our families. I mean family engagement, getting that support and sustainability from parents around their kid should be part of somebody's job. And it should look different than just getting like that weekly check-in report, maybe that you're getting from families and parents. So this could be like a family navigator. We've seen a lot of courts implement that model. Family navigators are leading to at least better customer satisfaction. We're not necessarily seeing a huge change in recidivism when we look at the data around family navigators. But of course, recidivism with kids is not always a great measure anyway, because juveniles are bad at making decisions anyway. But we do see families and caregivers reporting that they feel more engaged in the process, more heard in the process. So again, family navigators, and that can be something that's shared across the entire juvenile justice system. This wouldn't be just for the drug court, right? This would just be part of somebody's job. In some places, I've seen coordinators take a little bit of a family engagement role. A lot of times this is happening more with your treatment providers. And so if this is family engagement of each individual family is something that you're expecting your treatment providers to do and something you think is happening in treatment, then I want you to think about how you're counting it, how you're sort of making sure that there's some uniformity to what's happening. And so again, think about this as being someone's job, and then that you have some things that you're writing down about it. So often with family engagement, we end up with that vibe thing, right? Where we feel like none of the families are engaging with us, but you don't really have anything concrete to back that up. So we want to think about it as somebody's job that you're counting and watching, and you're making sure that you're doing what you say you're going to do. You're collecting that data. That is key. Again, this going back to the training together as stakeholders, I put that twice because I think it's so important to make sure everybody, again, is working with court users in the same way. And then this idea of taking family voice seriously. If we're going to ask parents, we're going to ask families to give us feedback on how we're doing, and then we're going to discount all of the things they said. If we're going to say, maybe that's true, but I think it's just too hard to change, then we don't want to ask, because if you can't use the information, then you shouldn't ask for it, because you're not going to necessarily be able to take it as seriously as you should. So just something to think about as we're putting together your family engagement plan as a team, working together to talk about this. And again, this may be something where you're only going to start to collect data on your family engagement, and then you don't have any other ultimate goal. You just want to know how many of your families are at a level of that you would consider engaged. That's okay. You want to be sure you're clear about what your goals are. All right, I'm going to check now to see if we have any questions that have come in chat. All right, so we have a question of how difficult is it to get a family that has missed meetings or appearances to engage? And I don't have concrete data on this. I'm going to let folks who are in the audience, if you have thoughts about this, if you want to come off of mute and answer the question, or if you want to actually respond in chat, I would encourage you to do so. But what I'll tell you is that when we're talking to teams and we're looking across the life of a young person being in juvenile drug treatment court, they're with you for a long time, right? They're usually, you're usually at least 9 months with you, sometimes a year, and maybe even a little bit more. And what I hear from professionals is that I always think of it as like the rules of thirds. So you have about a third of families that are relatively engaged right off of the bat. They're not perfect, but they're relatively engaged. They're showing up. Then you have about a third that never really engage, that you try to bring along, but nothing ever really takes. And then there's that third in the middle, which often will start out as being unengaged, but then through really diligent work on the part of probation, maybe they're starting to see changes in their young person. Maybe they recognize that you are going to be flexible and not too hard on their kids, then they start to engage. And so I do think that you can move families from no show, no contact into somebody who's going to be more responsive. That is, again, when we think about, we go back to my my family engagement scorecard. You want to have a grade. You want to know which families are in that red zone or are getting an F in your treatment court class. And then you make a plan for how you're going to engage them. And maybe it's that you're going to say, we're gonna try different people reaching out to them, see if they respond differently to probation versus treatment. Maybe it's that you're gonna really offer them an incentive and you're gonna say, hey, we notice that you're not engaging, you haven't been able to come to court. We'd like you to start, and we're going to incentivize that by doing this. Maybe you're going to try a couple of different options to see if you can get anything. Now, of course, if somebody's not responding to a phone call at all or a text, and you have no way to have that initial conversation, that's one thing. But this is why I say that I think that having engaged families and doing family engagement well really does require an effort on the part of the team. And you really do have to sit together and say, this is the thing that we want to change, and this is how we're going to do it. Because it is hard. It takes a lot of work, because a lot of times you have folks that just are not that excited to talk with you. So that's kind of my strategy there. If other people have ideas, go ahead and throw it into chat. And otherwise, we're coming up right here at the end of our time. Does anybody else have anything that they want to ask a question about? You can put those in chat. I don't think I have a Slido for questions today. Let's see, what do we got? All right. So I want to let you know that we do have lots of training and technical assistance available to you as juvenile drug treatment courts. If you are a grantee